Our next speaker is Dr. Frank Bedu-Addo, Chief Executive Officer of PDS Bio. PDS is a clinical stage company working to solve a problem that has long limited the effectiveness of cancer immunotherapy, which is how to generate the right kind of T-cell response and sustain it within the tumor microenvironment. Their lead program, Versamune HPV, is designed to do just that. Unlike checkpoint inhibitors that rely on pre-existing immune responses, Versamune is built to create them, priming the immune system to recognize and attack HPV-16 positive tumors. When combined with other agents, including pembrolizumab, the approach has shown signs of deep, durable responses and extended survival. In their phase 2 trial in head and neck cancer, patients receiving the combination had a median overall survival of 30 months, more than double what we typically see in this setting, with a safety profile that was very well tolerated. Frank brings deep experience to drug development and biomanufacturing, and under his leadership, PDS has moved from concept to late-stage trials with a focused pipeline that may offer a new path forward in hard-to-treat cancers. With that in mind, I welcome Dr. Frank Bedu-Addo.
Okay, let's try something else. Okay, there you go. Well, for those of you who are not familiar with PDS Biotechnology, just please make sure you're familiar with the risk factors associated with the company and as filed with the SEC. So PDS Biotechnology is a New Jersey-based late clinical stage biotech company developing targeted immunotherapies for cancer. Our lead program is being developed to treat HPV-16 positive cancers, and the lead indication is targeting recurrent and or metastatic HPV-16 positive head and neck cancer. This specifically constitutes about a $4 to $5 billion opportunity in the United States and Europe. We announced this quarter initiation of our phase 3 registrational trial in this population of patients. This is the first ever registrational trial in HPV positive head and neck cancer. This program has been granted fast track designation by the FDA, and we anticipate that based upon the initiation of the trial and the fast track indication, we have strong potential to be first to market and also to be a market leader in this indication. So Versamune HPV trains and primes the immune system to specifically recognize and attack cancers that are positive for HPV-16. Now, this is a recent publication from the Lancet Journal. HPV head and neck cancer today has been described as a silent epidemic based upon the rapid increases in the incidences of this type of cancer. Now, what you'll notice over here is that the traditional head and neck cancers in the dark blue are increasing pretty slowly or quite steady over the next couple of decades. However, the dramatic increase in head and neck cancer incidences are specifically due to the most oncogenic type of HPV, HPV-16. So the increase in incidences of this cancer are almost exclusively driven by HPV-16. HPV-16 is the most oncogenic or cancer-causing type of HPV. And that's the target for Versamune HPV that trains the immune system to specifically recognize that cancer and attack the cancer. So what is the problem we're seeking to solve? This slide highlights that problem. If you are diagnosed with recurrent and or metastatic head and neck cancer today, you have a few options. Keytruda, which is probably the most successful drug today. You have Keytruda plus chemotherapy, or you have chemotherapy plus the EGFR inhibitors, Erbitux, also known as cetuximab. But what's important to note here is the survival of these patients. The median overall survival today is about 12 months. So if you are diagnosed with recurrent or metastatic head and neck cancer today, you have a 50-50 chance of living for 12 months. If you add chemotherapy to Keytruda, you gain an additional month and a half, about a month and a half in survival. However, you pay a significant price in toxicity. The toxicity, severe adverse events go from 17% to 72%. So for that additional month of survival, a steep rise in toxicity. That is the state of the art today in treating recurrent metastatic head and neck cancer. So let's move on to our trial design. So with Versamune HPV, as I mentioned, it trains the immune system to specifically recognize and target these cancers. We combine with Keytruda. Keytruda is given as approved, the dosage is given as approved by the FDA. It's given by IV every 3 months for up to 2 years. Right, so if you are able to tolerate Keytruda and you stay alive, you'll get it every 3 weeks by IV for 2 years. Versamune HPV is given by a simple subcutaneous injection in the upper arm. The patient gets a total of 5 doses. On the first 4 cycles, the patient will get the subcutaneous injection together with Keytruda, and the patient will get the 5th and final dose on the 12th cycle. Now, we only give 4 doses because in our phase 1 monotherapy trial, it was demonstrated that Versamune HPV induces what's known as a memory T cell response. And so it trains the immune system to recognize that target and continue to generate an immune response against HPV-16. So we don't have to continuously dose the patients. Now here we'll talk about the demographics of the patients. So the patients in our trial were typical of your main demographic, which are white males. We had over 90% of those in our trial. But what I want to point out over here is the CPS scores, the total PD-L1 combined positive score of these patients. What has been shown is that Keytruda works best in patients who have a higher CPS score greater than 20. In our patient population, however, the majority of our patients were in the lower CPS score range. 60% of them were in the low CPS score range. And also, if you look at the patients who had the prior treatments, over 80% of the patients had failed treatment with chemotherapy or chemotherapy plus radiation. So the key point here is that our patient population was not skewed towards the higher responders, but rather skewed towards those patients who had the potentially lower responses to Keytruda. So now let's look at the responses that we saw in our phase 2 clinical trial. At PDS Biotech, we believe there are 4 critical characteristics that the next generation of cancer therapies should have. The first is the majority of patients should effectively respond to those drugs. And here we see the waterfall plot showing the response rate. So below the baseline are the patients who have tumor shrinkage. And at first glance, you see that the majority of patients respond to this therapy. Right? Very importantly, if you look at the deep tumor responses, patients who had either 100% tumor shrinkage or 90 to 100% shrinkage, we see that in over 20% of the patients who were treated. We see a significant number in the blue, what we call the partial response. These patients had to have had at least 30% tumor shrinkage on 2 subsequent scans, at least 8 to 9 weeks apart. The green are those who had the complete responses, again, on subsequent scans 8 to 9 weeks apart, and the yellow are those patients who had stable disease. Right, so very, very encouraging responses to the treatment. That brings us to the second critical characteristic. Patient can have these responses. How long can we retain or maintain these clinical responses in the patients? That is where cancer therapy has fallen short to date. Can we maintain these responses in the patients long term? And that's what we see here on the spider plot. If you talk to any of the key experts who've worked on our drug, they'll probably point to this as the most impressive characteristic of the patient. What you'll notice here, the x-axis is time of assessment, and whether you had stable disease, partial response, or complete responses, the vast majority of these patients maintain those responses long term, which is very important. So we see durable anti-tumor responses. And that brings us to the next characteristic, which is survival. So what we notice on our Kaplan-Meier plot here is that our median overall survival is 30 months. Also, very importantly, if you look at the 95% confidence intervals, the lower limit of 19.7 months, or the lower limit of the 95% confidence interval, is higher than the best result that has ever been reported in this patient population. So what this says is that if you had recurrent or metastatic head and neck cancer and you went on the standard of care, you had a 50% chance of living for 12 months. However, if you enrolled in the Versatile 002 trial, you had a 50% chance of living for over 30 months. As you see, a number of patients have already exceeded that 30-month survival. So very encouraging survival results to date. And then that brings us to the fourth characteristic, which is safety. I mentioned earlier with the standard of care with Keytruda, 17% of patients had the severe adverse events grade 3 and higher. And when you add chemotherapy to that, it jumps to over 70%. Here, what we see is that only 9% of patients had a grade 3 adverse event. And so far, only 1 out of 87 has had a grade 4 adverse event. And this patient had the grade 4 adverse event more than a year after coming off the Versamune HPV therapy and was still on the Keytruda therapy. So again, very encouraging tolerability today. So again, as we sit here today, each of the four characteristics, deep tumor responses, responses among the majority of patients, durable anti-tumor responses, prolonged survival, and also excellent tolerability. So very encouraging results leading us into our phase 3 clinical trial that we initiated this quarter. As I mentioned, the first ever registrational trial in this patient population. So in this trial, this is a two-arm controlled study. The primary endpoint of the study, as highly recommended by the FDA, is median overall survival. In this patient population to date, objective response rates as well as progression-free survival have not translated to prolonged survival. And so what the FDA really wants to see in this patient population is prolonged survival. That's the primary endpoint for the study. The patients will be enrolled in a 2-to-1 randomization, two patients in the treatment group to 1 patient in the control arm. And what you'll notice over here also is that the secondary endpoints, objective response rate, disease control rate, duration of response, and progression-free survival. But we have built in 2 interim analyses after completion of recruitment, and that allows us to have early discussions with the FDA and also provides the potential for an accelerated approval pending the results of the trial. So based on all the data I shared today, we're extremely optimistic about this trial. Now, what I'm going to do next is to share some data, corroborating data from 2 other independent trials that are being run by independent investigators. And the first one I'll talk about is the ImmunoServe trial in locally advanced cervical cancer. This was led and run by MD Anderson Cancer Center, the radiation oncology group, and the results were published last month in Clinical Cancer Research. But first of all, what have they done here? The first thing they wanted to understand was what type of T-cell responses are being generated by Versamune HPV, and does Versamune HPV overcome the key limitations that have faced immunotherapy today? The key one being, can we generate the right kind of killer T-cells that actually target and infiltrate the patient's tumors? And what we see with these green bars here is that over a 24-week period, we see steady increase in accumulation of these active CD8 killer T-cells in the patient's tumors. So clearly generating the right type of targeted killer T-cells. But what they also did was to measure the amount of micrometastatic tumors that remain in the patient's blood, what typically would lead to metastasis and patient death. And what's very important here is, as you see here, as the CD8 killer T-cell response builds up, the micrometastatic tumors go down to 0. So this is a very important result. And so this is what was published in Clinical Cancer Research. So looking at these patients, combining Versamune HPV with standard of care chemoradiotherapy versus chemoradiotherapy alone. Right, and you see here that at 3 to 4 months, in the HPV-16 positive patients who were tested, 100% of those patients had complete clearance of their circulating tumor DNA. In the patients who were treated with the standard of care chemoradiotherapy, only 50% of those patients had clearance of the ctDNA. Now, very importantly, how does this translate to survival? If you had complete clearance of ctDNA, your 2-year recurrence-free survival rate was 93%. However, if there was any detectable ctDNA, that dropped dramatically to only 30%. And so what MD Anderson showed here was that if you were able to clear DNA, circulating tumor DNA, it was actually acting in these HPV-16 positive patients as a predictive biomarker of survival. Clearing the circulating tumor DNA led to improved survival in these patients. So what's the key takeaway from the study? Versamune HPV appears to be highly effective in generating the right type of killer T cells that effectively target and eliminate HPV-positive tumor cells, therefore prolonging survival of the patients. That's exactly what we see in our Versatile-002 trial, where we see in a 30-month median overall survival in recurrent metastatic head and neck cancer. Now, I'll move on to the third study. This is a study that was actually run and led by the National Cancer Institute. Now here, if you have a drug that's designed to specifically target a particular kind of cancer, what's the best way to confirm that the drug is actually performing that function? The best way to do it will be to get a set of patients who have that specific target cancer type versus those who don't have that cancer type and find out if there's a difference in response rates. That's exactly what the National Cancer Institute did here. They took patients whose cancers were positive for HPV-16, including anal cancer, cervical cancer, head and neck cancer, vaginal vulva cancers. And they also took patients whose tumors, the same type of tumors, but negative for HPV-16. And what you see here is quite dramatic. In the patients who were HPV-16 positive, a 75% objective response rate. In the patients who were HPV-16 negative, 0%. Again, with progression-free survival, 11.3 months versus less than 2 months in the patients who were HPV-16 negative. What this tells us is that Versamune HPV is doing exactly what it has been designed to do, which is to generate the right kind of immune response that specifically targets and eliminates cancers that are positive for HPV-16. In this study, in the patients who have recurrent metastatic disease, the median overall survival currently is at 42 months and counting. In these patients, the traditional median overall survival is 12 months or less. And so very encouraging survival in addition to these responses we see in here today. So as we progress through our phase 3 human clinical trial, there are certain key milestones that we anticipate that will occur over the next 6 to 18 months. Very important, we recently announced our successful IND with Versamune MUC1. So this is the second program based upon our Versamune technology platform. In this case, we train in the T cells to recognize cancers that are positive for MUC1. There's a broad range of tumors that are MUC1 positive, including colorectal cancer, ovarian cancer, non-small cell lung cancer, liver cancer, to name a few. This program is being run under our collaborative research and development agreement with the National Cancer Institute, and we anticipate that clinical trial will begin shortly. We also anticipate that sometime in the middle of this year we'll provide the update or final data readout from our Versatile-002 phase 2 human clinical trial that we just talked about. And then we have a third trial that's being run by Mayo Clinic, led and run by Mayo Clinic, looking at Versamune HPV and Keytruda in earlier stage oral cancer. So this is a neoadjuvant treatment of patients with early stage oral cancer. And then we have 2 additional programs that the National Cancer Institute is very optimistic about, being run and led by the NCI. And here what they're doing is they're looking at another of our drugs, what we call PDS-0180C. This is an IL-12 fused antibody drug conjugate. This antibody drives the IL-12 directly into the patient's tumors, activates and expands the T cells within the patient's tumors, but also suppresses the tumor's ability to hide from the immune system. So it overcomes immune suppression. Right, we anticipate this is being looked at in colorectal cancer and gallbladder cancer. We expect the data readout in the first half of next year. And again, we have another study going with the same asset in biochemically recurrent prostate cancer. This is PDS-0180C in combination with Astellas' Xtandi, which is a standard of care in this patient population. So this is a controlled trial with a dual combination versus the standard of care. And again, hopefully complete Versatile-003 recruitment. So one of the key things you'll notice over here is PDS's ability or efficiency in being able to bring together these collaborators who are very interested in progressing our therapies based upon the confidence and the data that they have independently generated using these PDS assets. So we're very encouraged by that. And so to conclude over here, what we'll see over here is that PDS Biotech has developed Versamune HPV, which has strong potential to provide some benefit to the growing number of patients who desperately need a more effective therapy. Head and neck cancer is a very debilitating cancer with approximately 3 times the suicide rate versus the general population. So we're very encouraged by the potential to bring a solution to this growing patient population. We're also very encouraged by the fact that we have the fast track designation, and together with the initiation of our phase 3 human clinical trial, have strong potential to be first to market in this indication and also to be a market leader. And as I conclude, I would like to say a big thank you to all our collaborators, all our key opinion leaders and clinical experts who've been involved in our phase 2 human clinical trials, 31 sites in the United States and Europe to date. Also like to say a big thank you to our collaborators at MD Anderson, Mayo Clinic, the National Cancer Institute, who have shown the confidence in our studies and willing to progress these trials through phase 1 and phase 2 human clinical trials, allowing the company to focus our resources on our Versatile-003 phase 3 clinical trial coming up. And of course, a very big thank you to all the patients who have participated in our human clinical trials to date. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.